This is the Planning Podcast, and I'm Richard Kimblin. In this episode, the Planning Podcast goes on a journey, a sustainable journey around the Duchy of Cornwall's development at Nansledan, Newquay in Cornwall. But our journey is an ambitious one, a journey around an urban extension which really is a new place, which is walkable, which creates an economy and establishes, most importantly, a community. This is a podcast which had to be preceded by a site view and a not inconsiderable amount of seafood. And again, for this podcast, it is a privilege to be guided by Lord Matthew Taylor, so well known as he is to all of you as a key thinker behind the garden settlement movement and the pruning and rationalisation of national policy which resulted in the 2012 framework. The Duchy's estate director is Ben Murphy. He knows the vision, implementation and current function of this new community and the new place like nobody else does. And so we're very fortunate indeed to have him with us. Thank you, Ben. So together we are going to look at what can be achieved for communities, the economy, landowners and house builders in what is essentially, technically, an urban extension in a low land value area. And whatever that is, can it be done elsewhere? We start off with Ben. I asked him, please guide us into Newquay, its social and economic context, and what the Duchy aspires to achieve there.
Okay, Richard. Yes, I think it's fair to call it an urban extension of the town of Newquay. Newquay, historically, you probably have to just go back and understand the context here, which is, Cornwall used to receive Objective 1 EU funding. It's some of the most deprived wards, not just in the county, but also in Europe. And I'm talking about indices of deprivation. Funnily enough, transferred from the Olympic Park previously in East London. And it's fascinating because often those areas aren't always easily identifiable. But if essentially that rural deprivation exists in Cornwall, it still does. But rewind 10, 15 years, and Newquay was identified as an area of growth alongside Truro, which is the civic centre. But Newquay, in order to bolster the town, originally the head of planning at Cornwall Council was looking at maybe an extension of only 400 homes, and we, the Duchy of Cornwall, who own a lot of land around Newquay, carried out an inquiry by design in 2005 to understand, what does more Newquay look like? What does the town need? Not just housing needs, but also social infrastructure and so forth. And then working together with that local authority, Cornwall Council, who are the unitary authority, of course, for the county. We expanded the ambitions with broader shoulders. They put a red mark around the Duchy land when we realised all the other opportunities that could be derived from a strategic development that was built on the same principles that we had established at Poundbury. And so what happened was we ended up with a master plan, if you like, a blueprint for 4,000 homes, and the aspiration to create 4,000 jobs, new schools. At the time, a cottage hospital. We're looking at super surgeries, they now call it, but that's terminology really. A new high street, and to change the dynamic of not just bolstering the town in terms of delivering that housing need for the wider area, but also the economy, which is incredibly reliant on tourism, and nothing wrong with that, but to diversify that and to provide, if you like, more skilled workforce, more diversity in the economy over a longer time frame. So we ended up with this 30-year master plan for mixed use, mixed income, walkable community that is really, I guess, a direct response to some of the sort of the more lower attainment of suburban sprawl that you've seen post-war up until and indeed continuing today.
Now that's a great phrase, that the low attainment of suburban sprawl, and you were talking about a walkable community.
Yes.
What I get from that is that you were trying to achieve something which was substantially different to many exemplars of urban extensions that one might go to as an example of an urban extension. You're trying to create something which is walkable,
Yeah,
and has this economic aspect of it as well, 4,000 jobs.
yes. There's lots of well-meaning and indeed on duchy land, if around towns where we are predominantly a rural estate. The reason we got into development management and controlling, if you like, the building of communities on our land is we're ultimately land stewards, but we realised historically we could sell land in, say, the 18th, 19th century to local private house builders who would build quality. And you'll see in Dorchester, the Cornwall Terrace, and all the hints that these areas were always duchy land or historically duchy land. And in a post-war period, there wasn't, just as there has been recently, an accelerated need to deliver housing, or a need to accelerate the delivery of housing, if you like, and to build it for local people affordably, which of course is the right objective. But ultimately, what did that lead to? And the unintended consequences of that are low attainment in monoculture, monotenure of suburban sprawl. So I can say well-meaning councillors and others would have allocated land in the past, and we wouldn't get in the way of elected members making these decisions, and we would sell our land. And what fundamentally changed for us was our current Duke, the Prince of Wales, the Duke of Cornwall, was adamant this wouldn't happen on his watch, and we were looking at historic towns and cities that we know and love, and seeing the mixed use and the mixed income and the vibrancy and vitality of these places, and what is it that everyone loves about these places that successive generations want to go back to live in and work in. And then you see the sort of the low income families that will live in areas of car dependency, where they wouldn't necessarily be able to afford the car, where there wouldn't be the opportunities for a job, there wouldn't be this ladder of opportunities in life, going back to those indices of deprivation that I mentioned before. And actually the ingredients of good placemaking, of true town planning, that was missing. That's really the germination, I guess, of the idea around the principles behind what we're doing, that is an evolution from Poundbury here to Nansledan, where we realised actually some of the hardest hit from that poor growth are those on lower incomes.
I then turned to Lord Matthew Taylor for his take on Cornwall and its need for communities, not just homes. He's a lifelong parliamentarian and sometime MP for Truro. Was he interested in Cornwall? I teased him.
Well, I'm sitting right in the middle of Cornwall now, so I live not far, in fact, from where Ben's working at Nansledan, a few miles inland. If you put a pin in the middle of the map, that's where I live. I live in a very different community. We're not by the sea, we're up in the sky, in the China clay pits and tips in the centre of Cornwall, the one place that mining really still takes place at scale in the county. And actually, I work on a project here, which is very different in style, but very similar in concept, which is one of the original eco towns, was St Austell Eco Town, now Carclays, but being delivered in a modernist style, but with the same ambitions around placemaking and community first and building community rather than building homes.
So, Ben, I've had the privilege of going to Nansledan, approaching it, seeing how one appreciates what is currently built out upon arrival. A school which doesn't look like a school, very, very balanced high street, a religious institution which is not keen on alcohol, immediately adjacent to an off license. It has a cafe which is obviously well suited to those who are 18, one that's suited to those who are 40, and one that's suited to those who are over 65. And it has Marcel Rodriguez, who will sell you a bespoke hat. So, but just talk us through what's been achieved and where the retail is, where the facilities are, how it fits in with the housing. If I was to go there, what would I see?
And very well observed, Richard, by the way, in terms of the age demographics on cafes. It's a traditional seaside Cornish vernacular in terms of its architecture itself. So when you first arrive, you'll see traditional architecture, the Cornish slate roofs, the granite lintels above doors and windows and on curbing. That's probably the immediacy of the horizon as you drive in. And then the mixed-use nature of those buildings, they are actually leading up to a thoroughly modern Art Deco style of architecture at the front there, for certainly thoroughly modern for the Duchy of Cornwall. Mixed-use buildings meaning retail, artisan shops on the ground floor with apartments above, and otherwise a very broad mix of house types up to larger detached properties and coach houses above garages and courtyards. You described very well there, I think, a lot of the businesses within Nansledan. It sits atop of a hill. It will eventually be 540 acres. I mean, that's the size of the scheme itself. But at the moment, we're 3 phases in, 5 years in, just over about 540 homes have been built, about 30 businesses here so far and growing, and quite a long list of interest in the scheme itself, but so much more to come over the next 20 years. It will eventually be 4,000 job, we hope, urban extension of the Cornwall coastal town of Newquay.
I then asked Lord Taylor about the Garden Villages and Town programme, the issues which Ben had been articulating and the Duchy's vision, and his preferred approach for dealing with those issues.
In this context, I originated the Garden Communities programme, the Garden Villages and Towns programme. I was involved with neighbourhood planning and the MPPF development and the MPPG. And what I became really interested in was the issue that Ben's been just touching on. Firstly, why are we delivering too few homes? And secondly, concluding that part of the reason, a very major reason we were doing that, well, 2 reasons really. One was the homes we were delivering were precisely the homes that people were worried were going to get built on the edge of their town or village. So they were getting exactly the kind of housing estates they didn't want. And each individual housing estate, there was a perfectly logical need in planning terms to add another estate. But then, of course, a year later, there was a need to add another estate and then another estate. And I just want to pick something that Ben said, which is Cornwall were looking at 400 homes on the short term. What the Duchy presented was a master plan for the long-term change and growth sustainably of Newquay, effectively wrapping up lots of little housing estate decisions that could have been taken year by year, and instead taking one big decision to create a place. And that was really the vision that I was trying to sell to government, that instead of taking each as a housing estate, you put that together over long-term vision. You then saw how schools and shops and pubs and cafes and workplaces and jobs had to be part of that. And the second reason we were under delivering is that post-war, as the planning system came in and restricted suburban sprawl, they wanted to regenerate the towns. They wanted to have planned extension of place rather than whoever wanted to put something up wherever they wanted to put it. But they recognised that in removing those development rights and restricting it through local plan making, you wouldn't be able to deliver enough homes without new settlements. And those were the new towns, building on the ideas of Ebenezer Howard pre-war. And what I essentially said is we need to put that third leg of the development tool back in to create new settlements as part of it to deliver enough. And when I talk about new settlements, I always say these are mixed-use communities. They're the full thing. They're a vision over the long term of how places will grow, but they aren't necessarily a standalone village or town. That's what I'm best known for. But they may be an urban extension, they may be urban renewal, but actually they're all better understood as villages or towns. And how I put that is, Nansledan, I think, will not be understood best, certainly not on a podcast when you can't see it, if we talk about an urban extension. It's much better to think about the villages of London. We all understand that London is made up of a series of communities, the Hampstead, the Highgates, the Islingtons, the Camdens, the Bermondseys, the wherever it might be, and each has its own high street, it has its own place, it has its own school, it has its own identity. And key to Nansledan is it will have a high street. It already, at 500 homes, has several cafes, many functioning shops. The first cafe opened almost at the word go. So we're growing a community here that, yes, is linked to Newquay. It complements and supplements Newquay, but it functions as a neighbourhood, a place, a village, a town, however you want to describe it, connected in the way that London's made up of many places. And actually our best historic places, as they grew, had that because, of course, they were all designed originally around walkability because most people had to walk to things. So that's why you got these series of shopping parades and town centres and so on, and partly because they were a merger of places, which has also happened in Cornwall. So I take people to Nansledan to look at 2 really important things. One is that if you take a long-term vision and don't think of it as a set of blocks of 200 or 300 houses to flog to a housing developer, but instead think about how you grow a place, which you may then do an agreement with the housing developer, but they're fitting into a jigsaw puzzle that you're putting together so that at the end of it, it creates the right picture. Then you can deliver this very high quality. And what you then find is, of course, people will pay more for it, it's delivered more quickly, and people don't resist the growth. So if you say, well, actually, we need a bit more, you actually have people saying, we'd like more because we like what you're doing. So you change the whole matrix of how this takes place. So urban expansion, technically, yes, it's attached to Newquay, but for all of these, the conceptual starting point is a full functioning community that replicates the best of the 18th, 19th, and early 20th century development, but does it in a 21st century form. And by 21st century, I mean that the houses are built to high sustainability values. We consciously have to think through how we'll deliver things because they don't organically grow in the way that they did the past. But they can be, as you see at Nansledan, based on very historic street pattern and form that people find very attractive, or they can be, as at Carclays, based on a much more modern form, but they actually still go back to those hearts of what we all understand as a successful neighbourhood, and actually understand it best after COVID. Because if you lived in those kind of places, your COVID experience wasn't bad. If you lived in places without services and facilities and parks and green spaces and so on, your experience of COVID was pretty miserable.
By this stage in the interviews, I had realised two things. Firstly, that I was entirely superfluous to the guests who were brilliant at interviewing themselves. And secondly, that there was plainly much, much more to mine here. We'd had the vision explained, we had the model, and so I asked Lord Taylor about how the development industry reacts. Listen to this and ask yourself whether true mixed-use communities are achievable at a scale of around about 500 dwellings.
If I've got any experience of sitting in meetings when people are talking about large-scale developments, mixed communities, they can get very excited about it, and then you find that when you say town centre first, we're going to deliver shops and pubs from the beginning, they start to say, oh, but you need a critical mass of 1,000 homes before you deliver anything. It will only support a tiny number of shops. I see endless examples of actually very large numbers of homes with next to no facilities. I think we've won the case for a primary school now. Everyone understands that certain road need sustainable drainage systems, all sorts of things, but they shy at the idea that you can create places with the kind of complex social provision that traditional places have. I'm sitting in a very poor mining village of around 1,000 homes, but we've got a substantial co-op, we've got a general store, we've got a fish and chip shop, we've got a Chinese takeaway, we've got a laundrette, we've got a butcher's, we've got a vegetable shop, we've got a toe and nail bar, we've got a post office, chemist. So 1,000 homes supporting a very wide range, and it's because it's built into the fabric. These little retail units, very cheap to rent, well below the size you'd be paying rates, are all there. And when they become empty, the landowner finds someone to occupy them. Someone thinks, I'll try this business. Some fail. Some have been there years and years, decades and decades. And it makes this place alive and work and sustainable because you can walk around the corner to get a lot of your day-to-day stuff. And of course, there's a school and all the rest of it. The idea you can do that in a new place, most people simply say that's not possible. They barely try. Some actively argue against it and try to resist it. And why I take people to Nansledan, and it's ahead of us at Carclays, but it's a perfect example because it's a poor community. The house prices aren't very valuable. It's not like Pambury. It's not kind of exceptional, but it is delivering right from the word go all these things. The first cafe went up with the first houses. You walked around it, Richard, because I took you there. And I know people who now go to cafes in Nansledan, not thinking it's part of a new development, but just because, oh, it's a nice place to go, we'll go to the cafe there. That at just 500 homes.
I mean, you're right. It's like a borough of London, a good boroughs, if you like. It's not a parasitical development, but it is. I mean, obviously, technically an urban extension, and you are connecting into the town because the centre of Newquay is still, where the train station stops and so forth. So we're still bolstering the town. You're right. We deliver most of people's daily needs here, and that's part of the plan. And I think what we would always say is this definition of where I think a lot of times there have been real missed opportunities, areas that actually have a lot stronger ingredients. I mean, proximity to infrastructure of transport, other conurbations and so forth, that have just delivered housing and nothing else. And that's, as I say, delivered needs, local housing needs, but not really overall the social fabric and cohesion of a community, not the socioeconomic impact it could have been. This is commercial suicide if you did just 200 homes at high spec in a low spec area, because as a landowner, you would be foregoing land value. As a developer, you would be building high spec, high value for low prices, and in other words, you high cost and low returns. But actually, when you've got a large strategic scheme, you have the opportunity to set that long-term vision. And of course, you do need to essentially have, I guess, a commitment to those quality outcomes, whether it be the supportive local planning authority, the landowner in our case that is willing to wait for its returns and add value over time. But ultimately, this isn't a charitable or benevolent endeavour. We're a land and property business, and what we see is value, creating value in the real estate as well by having those shops, those artisan shops, the kind of shops you'd like to be near your front door.
So then I asked Ben whether it's necessary to sell the benefits, to sell them to landowners, house builders, and to future communities.
You're absolutely correct. The benefits for us as a landowner, for the developers that are building here, is more than just a privilege. It's actually a really good commercial prospect longer term. And it's great to see those businesses, and there's a long list of businesses that now are lining up to locate or start up here. And of course, that's what's helping sell the homes. And it's a real privilege during lockdown in my job, with the amount every week I was having video conferences with businesses who were saying, I share your values. I love what you're doing at Nansledan. I want to start my business or grow my business on Nansledan. And we did ask Oxford Brookes University to carry out a survey, a business survey, to ask them why in this case they've moved to Poundbury. And we have 50% of the businesses there started on Poundbury. And there's about 216 businesses, 1.5 jobs for every home built. But just focusing on Nansledan, it's the same lessons that we learned, which is the accessible price points. This was the answer from the businesses to the questionnaire. The fact that you had these flexible leases that were affordable, maybe 2 or 3 or 5 year leases, just to help startups. We ourselves would see, I guess I would see, the glint in their eye, and I wouldn't worry about their covenant strength. So we'd get the artisan coffee maker. Costa Coffee could afford the high street at 25,000 a year plus business rates, and for £15,000 a year, we'd get the independent coffee maker. And I use those kind of examples because they were basically looking at the quality of place, the quality of accommodation, the ease of parking. All of these things actually help with staff retention. So as much as it's walkable, we don't deny the existence of cars, especially here in the southwest where public transport isn't as good as we'd hope. And that resilience, I think, is fascinating in good quality places. So, we're not immune to any recession, or the cycle, if you like, in property. Of course we're not. But what is it? And that's really what we're trying to learn from here. What is it about successful places that adapt over time? And I think it's that diversity of types of houses, that diversity of businesses, that mix of uses, the fact that everyone walks down the same street. So you've got that mix of tenures as well. I think that's fascinating because when you set out having a 30-year plan to deliver something, when you conceive it, and Nansledan was conceived really in the early 2000s. There was an internet, but we didn't really know about an Amazon, or Facebook, or an Instagram. But we didn't need to, do we? We just, because actually it's how we've created just, I think, that diversity in the mix of uses and in the mix of tenures, which has enabled the community to adapt as it grows, and will continue to through global pandemics and whatever else life is going to throw at us.
My view is that it's not really a house builder model. I don't mean that house builders can't deliver within it. And you've got, I think, 3 main house builders, one of which is a well-known name down here, but it's not associated with the Duchy. So that's Wayne Homes. You control the quality of the frontages. They're working to your master plan, but they are building their standard units. And one of the reasons I like bringing people to Nansledan is I'm able to say, look, for a landowner or a master developer, this can work. This isn't as bespoke as Poundbury. It's very much about delivering a great place, but in a way that the standard house builder can work within it. But behind the house builders needs to sit a long-term investor, because what you're describing is a long-term investment process. It's not very different from I used to talk to with Peter Freeman about King's Cross, where he had the post office pension fund sitting behind it, looking for a longer term return. Or when I was talking to L&G the other day, and they were talking about the model they've got as a pension fund. So they are very attracted to this because it's a long term investment in place. It's often happened in urban renewal, but it's very rarely happened in urban extension or new settlement. Not for a long time anyway. There is a role for the house builder within it, but the short term borrowing and financing of building houses and then selling them is not the same model that sits behind a placemaking one, or indeed at Carclays, the small Sligo town where I chair the partnership. Sitting behind that is a Rascom, which is originally Egyptian founded business, building whole communities around the Red Sea and the Mediterranean, and now in Europe too. Their model is all about the long term investment in land to raise values. And it does work, but it is a longer term process.
There's no doubt it works better with private SME house builders, because I think there's a clear alignment between them, who trade on their skills and reputation, that they can't compete with the volume house builders to win land, and they are actually very probably more reliant on us. And it's a very respectful, collaborative relationship, I might add. But there's no doubt that they have a bit more appetite, I guess, for the longer, patient game, and the greater dividends that reaps.
I think that there is a myth that only the duchy can do this because it's somehow different. That isn't the case. You do have to have a vision of place. You do have to have a long term controlling mind. That can be the original landowner, it can be a new landowner who's acquired it. We understand this in urban regeneration. Look at Elephant Park, look at King's Cross, that we do know that this can work. And where you don't have that controlling vision, Nine Elms, it doesn't work. Now, that is no different from what we're talking about. It's why I talk about the pension funds and others who are prepared to invest long term in place, but there are many other forms of that investment to take place. The house builders can build the houses within that vision and to that vision, and they're going to be the best people to build those houses, but someone has to sit behind it with a vision. And I started all my thinking on this not by thinking about the duchy. The duchy just happens to, first of all, had Pambury, which showed it could work. But I think with Nansledan, they're showing it can work in a low value area to a form that can work much better for the house builders to be the general deliverers. Wayne Homes are doing it, and most people in Cornwall did not believe that Wayne Homes could, if you like, be corralled to do this well, but they've seen the benefits of it. Up at Carclays, we're just selling the first homes there, different style, but same principle, and we're getting a 17% premium over local house prices. Now, local house prices are very low, it's a poor area. What that shows you, though, is that if you create a community that has a distinct identity and an attractive one, and where people, even at the very start, can buy into a vision, that has value for people. But when people say there's a very special landowner, no, there isn't. What there is a very special vision, and it's a vision of creating place. But this happens in other countries in the world all the time. It's only in the UK that we've ceded this to people who are essentially just bashing out boxes. Indeed, some of those box bashers, their origins were in placemaking. That's where Barrett's originally were. I think it's about supply of land. It's about how do you put the land together in this way? How do local authorities think not about a red line that simply allows permission to house builders, but a local plan that has a vision of place? We were doing this post-war. We were doing it in a different form pre-war. It was what Ebenezer Howard talked about. It's how other countries do it as a matter of course in Europe and in parts of the States and elsewhere. And it starts by saying, not Truro is short of homes, where do the next 200 go, and having a fight about it, but saying, over the next 30 years, what do we want Truro to become? because over that period, it's going to be thousands of homes. And if we're doing thousands of homes, then we need shops and pubs and services and schools and doctors' surgeries to serve that. So let's plan for that and then enable the house builders to work to that plan. The most annoying thing in the conversation, Richard, is you saying very special landowner, here's the duchy, and that implication that only they can do it. It's simply not the case.
Excellent. So
I mean,
go on, Ben. Go on.
Sorry.
You tell me. Give me both barrels. Matthew's given me barrel one as to why that proposition is wrong. You give me barrel two.
Previously, I've worked, on the Olympic Park, which admittedly was a £9.35 billion budget for accelerating the regeneration of East London by decade, and brought a lot of its own complications with it. And before that, I worked for Countryside Properties, who were an exemplar house builder that did also have the stomach for estate regeneration, which is the most complicated form, I think, of urban renewal as opposed to just new growth. And having a supportive local planning authority, in the case of the 5 host boroughs in London for the Olympic Park, was as important as the budget. Having a supportive local planning authority, when I worked at Countryside Properties back then, who had an excellent reputation, and a local authority would be very pleased to have in the room a house builder, had a commitment to the same quality outcomes that they did, whether it be design and build quality or apprenticeship schemes or the sustainability standards, because it was in the integrity and DNA of that private company at the time, and it was a privately owned company, and so very much in the mold of its creator and owner. But they wouldn't always be able to pay the most for the land. So being able to try and say, at the time it was very difficult because the local planning authority would have to, just like say a landowner would have a prerogative to, but in the case of the local planning authority, I think by law, they had to seek best value and sell their land to the highest bidder. Essentially, therefore, government in its various guises, alongside accelerated housing delivery as well, was saying quality didn't necessarily matter. It was about delivery of housing and also highest land bid paid. Well, something's got to give, and it will be in the case of building more cheaply and obviously protecting profit margins of the developer at the same time. So it would have to be. So looking at different constructs, I mentioned land disposal mechanisms is a term. It's a bit dry, but how, when we're at Countryside, we say, well, how can you go to the local authority and say, we will pay you more money over a longer period of time. We just can't afford to pay it all up front, but we'll commit to paying you the highest land value. We'll commit to those apprenticeship schemes. We'll commit to delivering that level of affordable housing. And in other words, the overall commitment to quality outcomes, including the bottom line, was greater for the public purse, for the positive outcomes of the project. And I think it's understanding that, how you procure things, whether it be central government, local government, public agencies, private landowner, or house builders. And it invariably does need not necessarily a form of regulation always, but an understanding over the fact that government really does have a part to play. And it's interesting you mentioned, of course, Argent before, and the chairman of Homes England is the former founder of Argent. So I think we're seeing a shift again away from that accelerated delivery, and I think where quality was perhaps left behind a little bit, where it was just about a numbers game. With government, and I think in maybe 5-7 years ago that was the case. I think now we're seeing, I hope, certainly with new planning policy, but certainly through Homes England, that sort of reigniting that sort of consciousness, I guess, around the opportunities that they, as landowners, and any landowner has to deliver the sort of the greater long-term benefits, including for their own public purse, I guess, or their own margins. So a supportive local planning authority, I mean, you can't do any of this if it's not actually designating the local plan something that the elected members have deemed actually appropriate for there and what they want to do. And they can help over a long period of time. It's that golden thread through the scheme, if they share that commitment to that vision. So is it a single landowner? You mentioned, I think, certainly, Matthew, the long-term vision earlier, and that's absolutely correct in terms of that master plan blueprint, that vision. And obviously that clarion call then, for the local authority, the developer, or the landowner to sort of nail close to that mast. But specifically, I'd say, does it need to be a single landowner? Well, that's an interesting point, because if everyone's got a commitment to quality outcomes, you'd like to think that all we're in the same direction always. But I think it really does help to have a single landowner, because you're not having to argue with anyone else but yourself over. And I think more than likely, hopefully, able to stick to that vision throughout the course of the scheme. And the going can get tough, especially on something like a 30-year delivery program. So often it's like planting a tree. You're doing it for the next generation. I don't mean to sound too trite about that, but it helps not just not because we're the Duchy of Cornwall, but there's no doubt it probably helps being a large landowner that you're able to take those long-term decisions without the pressure of shareholders or indeed your own performance targets. So I think I'm broadly agreeing with Matthew. I'm just adding a little bit more nuance to it, I guess.
What I want to add, Richard, is
Yeah, please do. Yeah.
I still think it's not necessarily a single landowner. I think it needs to be a single controlling organisation. So they may have several landowners where they've done a deal with them, the original landowners, but there is a single master developer whose project it is, working with landowners or under contract with them or whatever it might be. I always say to local authorities that they have a key role in this, and it's not about a design code or a red line, it's about local plan policies that are very specific, that you can only do this development if you do it in a way that meets the kind of things we've just been talking about. You need policy for that, because policy can be defended at appeal, which you'll understand very well, Richard. Design codes are often created and then forgotten or appealed against, or land is sold on, and then the house builder says, well, actually, that's all a load of rubbish. I'm not going to do it like that. I'm going to build my standard stuff. And they will argue that on viability and so on. So the local authority, I think, has to take a very strong and clear view about the basis on which they will approve applications that come forward, that it will be town centre first, that it will be an evolution and a sequential creation of place. But my heart does drop when there isn't a single organisation in control of the land, because then you get competing interests, and usually somebody isn't signed up to it.
Yeah.
It's a good point. I mean, it's the vested interest. A lot of what I do, there's no obvious immediate direct benefit, I mean, commercially to doing. So you have that progressive, receptive local authority, but who's carrying the baby? It's like laying that egg and growing the scheme. And actually, whether it be me meeting some of the businesses this morning I mentioned, it's a nurturing, really, I guess. And there is a regulatory side to this we haven't really covered. So the commitment to quality outcomes isn't just sort of warm words on either a website or a contract about a common aspiration. It's actually daily, weekly, and monthly setting that agenda and promoting that agenda and driving it forward. But also regulating in the sense of, we do have covenant controls, and we do, people will have to come back to us if they want to change use of something. And if it's not appropriate, we won't approve it. And I'm talking about fundamentally, the uses of buildings and the types of uses that would be appropriate for particular areas and that sort of thing. All of that does matter. And that is perhaps those covenants and regulations that you would see in some cases in a conservation area, areas, but we have a bit more teeth because we have control through land as well as the planning regime, which, as Matthew pointed out, can in some cases be overcome. Things can be renegotiated in planning or withdrawn and resubmitted, but actually you can't renegotiate with us if we don't believe actually it fits with the overall vision of what we're doing, and we don't have to actually justify that decision any further than it doesn't fit in with almost like the design manual of what we're trying to achieve here. So I think that's why I mentioned the single landowner helps. Otherwise, you've got to rely on other people agreeing with you throughout the process. It's not that we're particularly belligerent about things. It's just that we obviously have set and cast that vision, and therefore we're very protective of it, and we're doing it for the greater good. I mean, that's fundamentally the point. And I think most people accept that, and then expect it once they move or invest in here, because it's one of the reasons for doing so. They know they're not going to have maybe the rug pulled from underneath them in terms of what they're signing up to.
Thank you very much indeed, Matthew. Now, I now know what needs to be achieved via planning policy to make all of this work. But thank you very much indeed for finding the time this sunny spring day.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. And I just hope local authorities, people with land, people who want to make things that they'll be proud of in the future, just are willing to take this challenge on. And the key question that I will leave you with is, for every town, village, city, county in the country, I think we get the right answers by saying, what do we want it to be like in 30 years? And we get the wrong answers when we say, how many homes can we add this year on the margin to meet our housing needs this year? Because that will never deliver you a great place.
That's wonderful, Matthew. Thank you very much. Have you got the right time horizon? And if it's wrong, you get the wrong place. That's brilliant. Thank you ever so much, Matthew. Ben, I now have, I think, completed most of my CPD for the year, having learned so much during the course of our hour together. So thank you very much indeed. And I'll have to see if I can persuade my family to come to Cornwall again so that I can guide them round Nansledan in its next phases. You can see that the Kimblin family has exciting trips out.
I can indeed, Richard. Well, thank you very much, Richard. It's been an absolute pleasure. And we actually do have a new cafe terms agreed for. So you'll have to come back and tell us which demographic you think that's focused on.
Perfect. I love cafes. Thank you very much indeed, Ben.
All the best.
See you now. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.